So in this session, we're going to look at some of the JSON enhancements that were added in PowerBuilder 2019. First, we have the legal disclaimer, and then we'll go over the agenda. So I'm going to talk about myself for a little bit, just so you know what my background is. We'll talk about the JSON formats. Now, that's not necessarily new to 2019, but it's important information to understand what some of the enhancements are about. And then we're going to go into the specific enhancements. One of them is the ability now to import and export JSON to and from a data window on a row level rather than exporting all the rows, which is what we had to do previously. We're going to look at some enhancements to the JSON Generator, enhancements to the JSON Parser, enhancement to the JSON Package. I'll have a little demo, and then we'll have some questions and answers. Okay, so first, a little bit about me. I've been using PowerBuilder since version 1. I determined rather shortly after I was using it that this was something I could make a living as an independent consultant, and so I did that. I did that for 15 years. After that, decided it was time to go back to work for a regular company, and I joined with a company called Integrated Data Services, where I'm still at. That's 14 years. And at the time I joined them, they made their living, their bread and butter by PowerBuilder applications. We've since transitioned most of those to HTML5 JavaScript, but we do have some clients who still prefer to use the PowerBuilder app, and so we are still doing some PowerBuilder development. In addition to PowerBuilder, some of the other languages I'm fluent in are Oracle PL/SQL, Java, and C#. And then I'm involved in quite a few open source projects, but the ones I thought were probably of most interest to the PowerBuilder community are listed there on the slide. That's a little bit about the company I work for. Let's go ahead and get into the enhancements. So there's actually several different JSON formats in PowerBuilder 2019. There's simple JSON. Now that's the JSON that most applications work with. It's just data in the JSON format. It doesn't include metadata. That's where Appeon provides the standard data window JSON. That is a version of JSON that not only includes the data, but includes metadata about the data. That is so we can take advantage of the optimistic concurrency of the data window, because we can pass state information down to the client and back up to the service, and so that the data window then can look to see what original values of columns were and determine if there are update collisions, that kind of thing. That's something that's typically not done with REST web services, which is typically where you're using JSON at. There's also a model stored JSON. I mentioned that because that was introduced in the original version of PowerBuilder 2019. That is being deprecated in R2. So I mentioned there for completeness, but I would not recommend you spend any time with it. Either use simple JSON if you're interacting with other clients that need to have, or other services that need to have the data in just plain JSON format, or if you're just doing internal development where the server and the client are both PowerBuilder, then you can use the standard data window JSON format and achieve a little bit more functionality through your services. So here's an example of simple JSON. So it's just name value pairs, and then there will be structures of that data or arrays of that data. And here's an example of standard data window JSON. So you notice that there is a GUID for the identity. There is a version. There's actually the name of the data window that this was generated from. And then there's a number of different sections here. There's meta columns. It's the metadata information about the columns. And these are essentially the buffers, the primary, filter, delete, and data window child buffers. that are represented by the JSON. So we get in the column metadata, and so this describes the name of the columns, their data type, whether or not they're nullable. A lot of information that you just don't get when you're dealing with simple JSON. Here's an example of the row information. So there's a row status. So this is how we're passing row status back from the client. Then in the column information, notice we have current value. There's a column status, so that's basically the get item status for the column, and this is the get item status for the row. And that's got the original value. And as I mentioned earlier, that means that when the data window gets this data in the service layer, it can compare the original value that was retrieved from the database, not the current value that the user sent back, but the original value was retrieved from the database when this data was sent down to the client, and check to see that that data is still in the data in the table. If it doesn't find that original value, it knows that somebody else has done an update, and we have an update collision, and then we can deal with it appropriately. What happens with a lot of REST web services is about the only way you can do that is if you put, let's say, a timestamp column on the row and send the timestamp column down to the client. Don't let them modify it, and then when you get the timestamp back, you compare that timestamp value to the data that's in the database. It'll tell you that there's been an update. It won't tell you what was updated, though. When you're doing REST, it's stateless, and so it doesn't have any information about what the data looked like before the transaction happened. Once again, this is more information that's in the row. So here's your column name and then your values. Okay. Now that was the structure. Here's some example of some data. This is simple JSON. So there's this bracket, means that this is an array, although there's only actually one row in this array. That square bracket. Then the curly bracket indicates this is a row, and then we have the actual attributes within that row and the values for them. Okay, so it's very, very plain, very simple. Here's an actual example of data from a data window. There's actually some other attributes in here that I didn't mention in the previous slide. So there's a platform, there's a mapping method. Here's your data window object. Here's the names of the columns. That's the first column right there, user ID, title, and body. And so it indicates whether or not they're nullable, what their data type is. The column number essentially is the index. And so here's your primary buffer. And so the row status is 1. And that means there was actually a change to this row. Then in our columns, notice the user ID column, there's only one value provided. That means the value wasn't changed from what was originally retrieved. So the user ID didn't change, the ID didn't change. The title didn't change. No, it did change. It was the title that was changed. The body didn't change, so there's only one value for the body. Here's the title. Now we're seeing this is the new value. This is the one indicating this column was changed, and then this is the original value that was in that row. Okay, so enough about the formats. Let's continue on with data window row level import and export. There's a number of arguments here for your import row from JSON. The first argument is going to be the JSON string. Then you have a long that is going to be the row that you're going to import the new row after. So anyway, this next argument. This is like if you ever work with the data pipeline, where you pass in a string by reference, and if there's any errors during the data pipeline, you get the information back in the argument in the string that was passed in as an argument. That's what's happening here as well. So you pass in a string by reference. That's optional, but you can pass in a string by reference, And then if there's any errors during the import, you'll get information back about what went wrong. And finally, another optional argument is the actual data window buffer you want to import it into. Primary would be the default, but you could import row into one of the other buffers if you wanted. And then the export row as JSON is just the only arguments there is the row you want to export, and then optionally which buffer you want to export it from. Default being, of course, the primary, but that would allow you to export JSON out of one of the other buffers as well. There was something I wanted to mention here. Oh, when you do an import row from JSON, the status it takes is not modified. So that's something to be aware of. If you import a row as JSON and you want to be treated as a sort of add operation, you would need to set the item status appropriately. Here's an example of some of the new functions in work. This is the original code of a sample I did for last year's Elevate, where I was interacting with a third-party REST API and loading the data into a PowerBuilder data window, and then allowing the user to edit it and then send it back to that REST API. This is loading the data, and the way this worked, I had a data window that basically mapped one-to-one with the columns in the service. Now, because that was the case, I could have easily just retrieved the JSON as I'm doing here. Well, actually, that was done in an earlier step. This is where we're doing the import. I could have just used the import JSON function and imported the data all at once. What I was trying to do with this sample, though, was show what you would do if your data set in your data window did not match that of the service. And so what I was doing here was actually looping through the rows in the JSON and grabbing each value and then setting each value into the row in the data window. So this is what we needed to do if we were going to do the importing of JSON in it where the column sets don't match, basically looping through and setting each row and column. This is the new code. It doesn't look terribly different, but what's actually happening here is I'm still looping through and still grabbing the values from the specific columns I want, but instead of inserting them directly into the data window, now I'm generating JSON for that row. I'm using the JSON generator here. So I take each value that I want and I add it to the JSON that I'm generating, then generate the JSON for that particular row with the columns, with only the columns that I actually want to have in the data window, and then I do the import row from JSON here. So not necessarily didn't really save very many lines of code, but it does. It's at least an alternative technique. This is an example from the update. Now this is the original code. Now this does assume that the data window structure and the web service that you're calling, the structure of the data you need to send do match. So what I did here is once again I'm using the JSON generator. I grab each value from the data window that I want to send, and then generate a JSON string with all those columns, and then send the request. This is what it looks like with export rows JSON. Now, because my columns do match, I'm able to just use the export rows JSON and do the send request, sending just that one row. And this is a case where we really couldn't have used like the export JSON, the original export JSON function, because that would have exported all the rows. And this is a either an update or, well, this is an insert. This is an add method that only takes one row. So we have to actually, send it one row at a time. And then the update works kind of the same way with that particular service. Anyway, so that's import row, export row. Now we're going to look at the JSON generator. There's been a change to the save to file function. There's an additional optional argument now, which allows you to specify the character encoding. The default is encoding UTF-16LE, which is not typically the standard format you find JSON saved in. It's usually UTF-8. So that's something where you might want to specify UTF-8 when you go to save the JSON. This is an example. So you have save the file name, and then, like I said, the argument is optional. It will just default to encoding UTF-8 16LE if you don't specify it. Same thing for get JSON blob. There's no first argument. So get JSON blob will just get a blob, but that blob will be in UTF-16LE format by default. If you want it in some other format, then you need to actually specify that you want it in whichever other format you want it in. JSON Parser, there's some new features here. One of them is contains key. So in JSON there is the idea of optional attributes, and if you code PowerBuilder to go out and access an attribute that doesn't exist, using the JSON Parser, you'll get an error. So what you can do is you can do a contains key first if you know it's optional, just to see if it's there first before you try to access it. And then there's also get item type. That allows you to a little bit more dynamically parse JSON. With the original JSON parser, you had to know what the type of data, the data was when you went to grab it. With the get item type, you can ask first, what type is this data? And then based on that, branch to use the appropriate method to get the JSON, to get the data out of the JSON. So you can either pass in the item handle for this next one, or you can pass in the parent item handle and the key value. And then the JSON item types are string, number, boolean, null, object, and array. Okay. The JSON parser has a new property to return null when error. What would happen originally is that, and this is the default still, is that if there was an error, you would get an exception. And so if you'd say, go give me this key, and the key wasn't there, you'd get an exception. What you can do now with JSON parser is you set return null when error to true, and then if you go to access a key that doesn't exist, it will just return null. So that's perhaps a different way of handling the optional attributes. You would just get a null back then if the attribute wasn't on the row. This is the JSON parser still, but like the generator we already talked about, there is a new save to file with an optional argument with the encoding, and the blob with the encoding. And then finally we got the JSON package. When you were originally working with the JSON Packager, you can only send in strings, JSON strings, to the packager, and retrieve the JSON as a string. That's been changed. Now there's specific data types: blob, boolean, date time, number, string, and time, and also set. There's also been some added functions that allow you to get and set value directly from the data window into the JSON package. So the first function here, get value to data window, means we're actually getting the value from the JSON package and putting it in the data window. So that's why you have a reference to the key here. That's the key to the with the JSON Packager, you actually put together, you take several different JSON payloads and you kind of merge them together, and each one has a key. So each one is like a full data set, can be a full data set. So your get value to data window would take one of those data sets, referenced by key, and populate the data window using that data set. So the required arguments are the key and the data window control. That could be data store, data window child as well. There's a boolean that would indicate whether or not you reset the status flags. This should say ref. It's a string you pass in by reference to get back any error messages. Optionally, you can specify the data buffer that you're going to import the data into. That would default to the primary buffer. And then you can also indicate the start row and end row that you want to import the data into. Anything after that first curly bracket is optional. Now to go the other way, we've got data in a data window or a data store, data window child. We want to add it directly into the JSON Packager. We can do that using the set value by data window method. Once again, you're going to indicate the key because that's going to be the new key you're going to add to the JSON that's already in the packager. With this, oh, I'm sorry, went backwards. So this would be the new key for this new block of data that you're going to add. You'll give a reference to the data window control, and then once again that could be a data store, data window child that has the data that you're going to add to the JSON Packager. And then the Boolean that format, this is where we have the either the simple JSON or the data window standard JSON that I mentioned at the beginning of this session. So if you set that to true, you get the data window standard JSON. False means you get plain JSON. Here's another version of that. So you can actually specify a buffer that you're optionally specify the buffer that you want the data out of, and there's a Boolean flag that indicates whether you just want changed rows or if you want all the rows. One more version. This is allows this actually breaks out the buffers, data window buffers. So there's a flag for the primary data buffer, a flag for the filter buffer, a flag for the delete buffer, and a flag for all the data window child buffers. And once again, we have the Boolean format indicating whether or not we have simple JSON or data window standard JSON. And then one more. So this one is like the first one, except that we can also give a starting column and ending column. Okay. New methods similar to the JSON parser. There's a get item type and a return null and error. And that's it. So I am going to give a little demo here, and then we'll have questions and answers. Okay, so we're going to look at some of these JSON features. First, we're going to look at the JSON formats. So I'm retrieving a row of data into the data window from a REST web service. I'm using the export JSON rather than the individual row JSON function here to export this JSON. So that's why you get these brackets at the beginning and end, because the data window knows it's usually working with an array, and this particular array just has one row in it. Anyway, the bracket indicates that it's an array. The curly bracket indicates that's the beginning of our row, end of our row, and then we have the column and value sets, and that's all that's in sample JSON. This is data window standard JSON. So we got our identity value, we got the platform, the data window object name, the metadata about the columns, And in this case, I didn't make any changes. So we got a row status of 0 for the row, and then all you see for the columns are just the original data values. Now if I go in here and make some changes, and then export that JSON again, you'll notice this part of the metadata didn't change. Everything was the same up there. But now you notice that we have a row status of 1. That indicates that the column was actually modified. And then down the first 2 columns I didn't change the value of. The second columns, the third column, the title column, this is the new value. This is the indication there was an update. This was the original value. And here for the body, the same thing. There's the original value, the new value, the one indicating that there was an update, and then there is the original value there as well. So that's the difference in the 2 standard JSON formats. I guess for completeness, what I should show you, I'll do a retrieve 1. There's what the JSON looks like. Now if I make that same change, and then we export that, all we get is the new data. There's no reference to the old data. There's no column or row level status information. It's just plain data. Okay, so that's the JSON formats. This is an example where I'm actually using the import row and export row. So I'm going to retrieve much more data from this particular REST web service. I'm going to take one of these rows, that one right there, let's say, and I'll export it as JSON. This is simple JSON. Notice it doesn't have the square brackets on it because I'm not using I'm doing it at the row level basis now. Before I was using the export JSON, which works on the entire data window data set. This is just exporting a single row, so we don't have the square brackets. We just have the curly brackets indicating beginning and ending of a row. And now I'll go down here, I'll select a different row, and I'll import that row back in. Okay, and so there's that same row imported back in above the row that I'd selected. You can see all the data is the same. Of course, if I did an update, that would generate an error, but that just demonstrates how the export and import work. Okay, and then lastly, I didn't have anything for the JSON Generator or the JSON Parser. I did have something here for the Packager. And so I'm retrieving once again a bunch of data from this REST web service. And as I mentioned in the session, what the Packager does is it takes multiple data sets and combines it into a single JSON payload. Right now, I'm going to use the set value by data window. That just grabbed all the data that was in this data window, exported the JSON, and then packaged that within here's the key I stuck on, demo. So this data set is called demo, and what you could do with the JSONPackager then is add additional data sets and then send multiple data sets as one block of JSON data. Then what you do on the other end is you parse out those different data sets, and that's what I'm going to show here. I've only got this one data set in here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset the data window. So the data window is now empty. Now I'm going to use the get value to data window to go ahead and look for that demo key and then grab all the data for the demo key and stick it back in the data window. And that's what just happened. Okay, so pretty quick. And it's just a single line of code, essentially. Okay, so that's the JSON formats, the row level import export, and the JSON packager. And now we're going to go back to the session and slides, and we'll have our questions and answers.